before you get started.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So we are working on part 3 of a 4-part webinar series. And the first session was on obligations and sidewalk basics. A couple weeks ago we talked about safe and accessible intersections. Today we're going to talk about curbside access, and then in a couple of weeks we're going to talk about how to make it all work and ensure access in your public right-of-way projects. Slide 16. So today we're going to talk about everything off of the curb. We got you down the sidewalk and to the curb ramp and the pedestrian signals and across the street. So now we're going to look at the legal obligation review, standards and guidelines, and then we're going to talk about on-street parking, passenger loading zones, and on-street transit facilities. Slide 17. So if you've been with us the last couple sessions, we're reviewing the obligations because they're overarching and they apply to everything we do in the public right-of-way guidelines. So in 1973, Congress passed the Rehabilitation Act, and Section 504 applies to entities that receive federal funds, prohibits discrimination in programs and activities, and it's enforced by both the DOT or Federal Highway. In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a civil rights law, prohibits discrimination in provisions of facilities, services, and programs. And our right-of-way infrastructure has been determined by the courts to be one of the programs that Title II agencies, state and local governments, provide to their citizens. The Americans with Disabilities Act is enforced by the Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation, Federal Highway. Department of Justice enforces it under program access requirements that apply to all Title II agencies, and DOT, Federal Highway enforce it because DOJ a lot of times will pass on transportation complaints to them because that's their area of expertise. Next slide. Slide 18. So standards that we have to follow to provide access initiate with the U.S. Access Board. The Access Board is an independent federal agency. They develop guidelines based on the minimum level of access. And once those guidelines are published in a final form after a lot of public comment and regulatory assessment, then they can be adopted by other federal agencies to become standards. So the Department of Justice adopted the guidelines that the Access Board put out for buildings in 2004 to become the 2010 ADA standards. In 2006, the Department of Transportation adopted those same guidelines, and they became the 2006 ADA standards for transportation facilities. Those are both still focused on building access. When we look at public right-of-way, we have a proposed guideline. It's not a final guideline, and it still isn't a standard. Slide 19. But we still have an obligation for access in the public right-of-way. If you're a Title II agency, a state or local government, you can't discriminate against people who have disabilities. So you do have that obligation even if you don't have a standard to follow. When we talk about access in the right-of-way, there are a couple standards that apply. The regulations specifically say that curb ramps have to comply with the 2010 ADA standards, even though they're primarily for buildings. And that's a regulation, we just have to follow it. But there's flexibility in design for areas that aren't covered. So what are we supposed to do in the public right-of-way? And we can use the 2010 ADA standards, but they don't fit especially well. And we can use the proposed public right-of-way accessibility guidelines, which were developed specifically for the right-of-way, but haven't been published as a final guideline yet or adopted as a standard. We can also look to the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is also known as the MUTCD. And we also have AASHTO, which is the American Association of State and Highway Transportation Officials. And they provide engineering guidance on highways and streets, pedestrian facilities, and bicycle facility design. And the reason the bicycle facility design is important, that AASHTO publication has the guidelines, probably the best guidelines for shared use paths that we also apply the public right-of-way guideline rules to. Slide number 20. So the things that we're going to talk about today, they aren't in buildings, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about curb ramps. So they're the other things that aren't covered. And we're going to be talking mostly about the 2013 Supplemental Notice for the Proposed Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. And when we talk about transit, we'll also talk about the 2010 ADA, or Federal Highways ADA standards from 2006. So this is the 2013 Supplemental Notice is somewhat difficult to find on the Access Board website, but if you go to their standards and guidelines and then to shared use paths, you will find the Supplemental Notice for the right-of-way. Slide 21. So regardless of what you're doing, new construction, you still have obligations for access, and new construction is required to be accessible. But new construction is pretty narrowly defined. It's building something in a place where you have no existing constraints. So we talked before about how it would be like a new subdivision or a new development where you don't have platted streets and you don't have utilities already running through, where you had the opportunity to set your grades and your utilities and your property lines where you can accommodate the best level of access. Alterations to existing facilities have to be accessible to the maximum extent practicable within the scope of the project. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Existing facilities, even if you haven't altered them, cannot deny access to persons with disabilities. And that's where a transition plan comes into play. Slide 22. So alterations versus maintenance. An alteration is a change that affects the usability of a facility. And that's true no matter whether you're working with the DOT standards or the 2010 ADA standards or even the public right-of-way guidelines. So you have to follow you have to meet the requirements for, you have to meet all the requirements for new construction to the extent practicable. And what that means is if you can't get things perfectly right and perfectly accessible, you have to do it to the best of your ability. So if you can't get 8% slope on a curb ramp, and 10% is the best you can do, that's still better than having a vertical curb that no one can use. It will reduce the number of people possibly who can use the facility. So you always push for the maximum extent practicable when you're doing your design and your construction. But another part of that requirement is within the scope of the project. So the expectation is that your project has finite limits. They can be geographical or they can be service related. So you might be doing new sidewalks and curb ramps or a bus stop on 1st Street from Main to 3rd, and that would be a geographical limit. You might also just be doing signal work, and signal work may not include doing concrete work that gives you the opportunity to build curb ramps. So the scope of your project can be location, or it could also be the type of work that's being done. And maintenance does not require accessibility improvements. So if you're working on the sidewalk, you need to make it accessible. If you're just filling the cracks in the sidewalk, then that's considered maintenance, and you don't have to make accessibility improvements. Slide number 23. So now we're going to start with scoping and technical requirements for on-street parking. Slide 24. So the scoping for on-street parking is a little bit different than you might expect. Scoping is where you determine how many or if you have to do something. So scoping is always found in Chapter 2 of the Public Right-of-Way Guidelines and the Building Standards. And scoping for parking is based on the number of marked or metered spaces around the perimeter of a block. So the perimeter of the block in the picture, if you look at the dark red square, and I tell people if you go outside your door and you walk around the block and never cross the street, that's the perimeter that you've walked. And so you would count the number of marked or metered spaces and then apply it to the table. And if you have spaces that are metered, say you're using a pay kiosk of some kind, but you haven't marked the spaces individually, then you would measure and use 20 feet as one space. Slide 25. So this is the table. If you walk around the block and you have 32 marked or metered parking spaces for your on-street parking, then you would need 2 of those to be accessible. And in the building standards, you're required to have 1 in 6 accessible spaces be van spaces, and at least 1. But for on-street parking, there is no requirement for van spaces. It's not scoped, so the absence of a requirement means there is no requirement. And you're also required to use the international symbol of accessibility to mark them. Slide 26. So what if you don't have a block perimeter? Sometimes you end up with a street where you only have, you might have an ocean on one side and parking around the buildings, the commercial buildings in the front. The picture that you see is a picture of, it's actually a big city zoo, and you can barely see all of the cars parked along the parallel parking along the city streets that run around the zoo. So there is no real perimeter to count. So the best thing to do is look at, easily divided spaces. You can still look at all of the parking spaces that contribute to the area and disperse your parking. So there is no requirement right now. You can make up a policy, but the best idea is to divide it up into reasonable pieces and then disperse your parking among them. Slide number 27. So these are best practice, and they're not part of the standards. So they're things that it's good design above and beyond the minimum standards. There is no dispersion requirement for on-street parking. But when you look at the areas that you're putting your parking, there are some places that are going to be used by more pedestrians or more people who have disabilities. And some of them might be the post office, might be a government building, could be a medical facility. So dispersing the accessible parking close to the places where people will use the most is, it's good design. And looking at the structure of your street in the area where you have your on-street parking. You want to put your accessible parking where you have the least crown and grade. So you don't want a sidewalk with a big crown in the center, and you don't want to put your sidewalk or your accessible parking on the steepest side of the block as you're looking at block perimeters. It's important to avoid street furniture and planting areas and signposts, and that kind of goes with any parking. Any passenger who has to open a door doesn't want to open it and step into a rain garden. And avoid bike lanes and cycle tracks when possible. There are places where parking is used to divide bike lanes from the vehicle lanes, and that's fine. That's a well-used practice. However, you're looking at your scoping going around the perimeter of a block. So if you can avoid putting accessible parking where someone who takes a little bit more time to get out of their vehicle has to get out into a bike lane, it's best to avoid that when you can. And it also, by avoiding the bike lanes and the cycle tracks, it allows a van with a ramp to lay the ramp down on the sidewalk instead of trying to do that into the bike lane. Slide number 28. And we talked a little bit about alterations versus maintenance. So what triggers a need to provide accessible parking? So you should have accessible parking, and when I work with people on transition plans, we always talk about how this is one of the low-hanging fruits. It's one of the simplest things to do, and you're required, when you do resurfacing or resealing of a street, that's when you're required to upgrade your parking to include accessible parking if it's not there already. So if you do, anytime that you have clean black pavement and you're getting ready to strike parking, you have the opportunity to add accessible parking where it's needed. If you're just doing maintenance, say you're restriping in the fall before school starts, seems to be a popular activity, then it's not a requirement to make changes and add accessible parking. So maintenance might be just restriping in place or pothole patching. In 2010, I believe, the Department of Justice put out some technical assistance on restriping. It applies to buildings, but the same concepts kind of apply to on-street parking. And the Access Board actually has some really good guides, again, for buildings, but they're guides to the ADA standards. They're on their website, and they have completed the section on parking, and so there's a lot of good information in there too. Slide number 29. So there are different types of on-street parking. We have parallel spaces, and parallel spaces can be done in two different ways, depending on whether you have a wide right-of-way or a narrow right-of-way. And there's also requirements for angled and perpendicular parking. And you can see in the picture that some streets have both. Towards the bottom of the picture, you have angled parking, and I looked a little bit closer in this area, and there is accessible parking here. It just happens to be really, really faded. And then on the top side of that street is parallel parking on the other side. Slide 30. So we're going to start with on-street parallel parking. And if you have a wide right-of-way, and we define a wide right-of-way as being at least 14 feet from the back of the curb to the right-of-way line. So where an adjacent available right-of-way exceeds 14 feet, an access aisle is required. Next slide. So your car parking space would be in alignment with the rest of the parking lane on the street. And an access aisle providing access to the sidewalk would be 5 foot wide, and it has to be part of a continuous route. So you need to be able to get from the sidewalk or the pedestrian access route down to the level of the parking space. So it has to be part of the continuous route, and that generally takes a curb ramp. And despite what's shown in the picture, detectable warnings are not required on a curb ramp at a parking space. So I should put an X on there, but there isn't one yet. So the access aisle has surface requirements the same as a pedestrian access route. Firm, stable, and slip resistant. You can have up to a 1/4 inch level change or a heave, and a 1/2 inch if it's beveled, and a 1/2 inch opening in the direction of travel. And of course you would want to avoid putting any storm grates or sewer openings or anything in that area if possible. There are no slope requirements when you're looking at on-street parking, not for parallel or perpendicular head-in parking. So in a building, the requirement is for a 2% cross slope and running slope on the access aisle and the parking space. But for public right-of-way with on-street parking, there are no slope requirements. So obviously your parking space in the parking lane is going to be the same grade as the road, and the access aisle should be as flat as possible, but there is no required standard. And it's also not required to be marked. Next slide. Slide 32. So here are a couple of examples. And the access aisle gives room for the passenger or the driver to have access, because a car can actually park in the area closest to the curb, like the truck on the left has done, or they can stay in the regular parking lane. And you have to be careful, because some state policies or local policies say that you have to mark the access aisle, and then they also have another policy that says you can be ticketed for parking in the access aisle. So if you intend to allow cars to park in either space, you do need to check your local policies. So when do you have to put in a parking space with an access aisle for parallel parking? When you do new construction, of course, it's the easiest. When you're paving your street and you're putting in your curb and gutter and you're building a sidewalk. But otherwise, if you're just resurfacing a road, there really isn't building an access aisle, and the setback parking is really outside the scope of the project for the most part, unless you're specifically doing an ADA improvement project. Then it might be considered part of the scope. If you're just doing a sidewalk project and you're not doing street or curb and gutter work, it probably isn't in the scope of your project. So this is an important thing to consider when you're doing a major improvement in a business area with on-street parking. But it's something that, a lot of times is just not part of the scope of the work you're doing. Next slide. Another way to do on-street parking, and this is the low-hanging fruit part, is if you have a narrow right-of-way, or if you're not doing an alteration that allows you to do inset access and access aisle, with a narrow sidewalk, so you have less than 14 feet between the back of the curb and your right-of-way line, you can locate your accessible parking space at the end of the block. And the reason it goes at the end of the block is that a person will have direct access to a curb ramp and be able to get onto the sidewalk from there. And it can be at either end of the block. So the picture on the left shows the parking with the curb ramp towards the front of the vehicle. The picture on the right actually shows a car or a parking space with the curb ramp at the back. So it's at the far end of the block. And the benefit of doing this is that someone who has maybe a scooter on a trailer, which you see once in a while, or some device that has to come out of the back of the car, a person can get direct access to the curb ramp from the last spot on the block, or the first spot, depending on how you look at it. Slide 34. So it's also really important to try to keep the adjacent sidewalks clear. And so if you go back, can I ask you to go back one slide, Barb? Thank you. So if you look at the sidewalk, if you pave clear up to the back of the curb, then a person who uses a van with a ramp that comes out can drop their ramp onto the sidewalk, and it makes it a lot safer and a lot easier for them to get out. The ramps typically deploy on the passenger side. Next slide. Thank you. So it's important to keep the adjacent sidewalks clear. And this is an example of accessible parking in a business area. And when you try to get out, if you're using a van, if you were a driver, you would be fine. If you were a person with a walker, you would probably have some problems. But it's important to keep the sidewalk clear. This van ramp is dropping onto gravel with a utility cover, and had they parked a little ways back farther, they'd had a bike rack in the way where there was some solid pavement. So in this situation, it creates a very unstable path to get to the sidewalk. So it's really important to think about this. And you can see where the parking signs are at the head and foot of the space. So that's a good thing, but it's all the other stuff that you have to watch for. So when you're doing those really easy, put your accessible parking in, you know, at the beginning or the end of the block, these are the kind of things you need to look for. Slide 35. So a lot of times you'll also see angled parking or perpendicular parking. And we said there were no requirements for van spaces, but every access aisle for angled or perpendicular parking is required to be 8 feet wide, and it has to be marked so that people don't park in it. It has to be clear, and it has to meet those same surface requirements of firm, stable. You can't have your curb ramp protruding into the access aisle. You can't have heaves more than 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch if it's beveled. No openings, so you don't want to put your storm sewers in here. And again, the picture shows detectable warnings, but you'll see there's an advisory in the proposed public right-of-way guidelines that mentions that detectable warnings are not required. And the access aisle can be shared. So perpendicular and angled parking can have a shared access aisle in the public right-of-way. Next slide. And where you have parking meters and pay stations, you have to make sure that the information is visible from a point 3.3 feet maximum above the center of the clear space. And I'm going to take a second here to harp on construction tolerance. 3.3 feet is 39.6 inches. So it's easy to say, well, let's just put it 40 inches. But that exceeds the max, and there isn't any reason why you can't have it at 38 inches or 37 inches. So when you build something to the maximum, you're probably making it so a few people aren't able to use it as well. And you also have to meet the operable parts requirements for parking meters and pay stations. Next slide. Parking signs, in building requirements, the required height is 60 inches, but when you're doing a parking sign in the public right-of-way, you're really dealing with something that's regulated as a street sign by the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And all street signs are required to be 7 foot. So the height for a parking sign in the right-of-way is 84 inches based on the MUTCD. That also puts it above the protruding object height of 80 inches. And they should be placed at the head or the foot of the parking space, again, so that we have that clear space in between and we're not cluttering it up with parking meters or signposts. And they're required to include the international symbol of accessibility. So here's a question for everybody. Are you allowed to have an alternate symbol besides the international symbol of accessibility shown in the standards and guidelines? The answer to that is, if you do, it's risky. There are some alternate symbols out there. We call them the speedy wheelie man sometimes. It looks like a person in a wheelchair in a more active pose, I guess. The Access Board has weighed in on alternate symbols, and Federal Highway has also provided technical assistance based on what the Access Board has said. And the international symbol is accepted and well recognized. So that's what you need to use where you have a requirement to use the international symbol. If you use a different symbol, you may consider it to be equivalent facilitation. That will someday probably go to court, and the courts will have to decide whether it's equivalent or not. There's no other way to really make that determination. So if you're adverse to taking risks, stick with the international symbol. like you're supposed to. Next slide. Slide number 38. So on-street parking and pay stations have to meet the operable parts requirements. So you need to be able to sit in a wheelchair or stand with using a walker or cane in a clear space that's 30 by 48 inches. And the clear space is required to have 2% cross slope. And the reach range, if you're reaching it from the side, if you're sitting sideways, you have to be within 10 inches. But if you have to approach it from a forward position, then you can't have any obstruction at all. So the front of your clear space has to be adjacent to the surface, the drop-down plumb, I guess, of the surface of your operable parts. And the operable parts can't require tight grasping, twisting, or pinching, and a maximum of 5 pounds pressure to operate them. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about passenger loading zones now. And passenger loading zones are not required in the public right-of-way guidelines. They are required in buildings, or they are required in some specific instances for buildings. And if you provide them in the public right-of-way, then you have to have them signed with the international symbol. You have to provide an access aisle, and the pull-up space for accessibility has to be 8 foot wide by 20 foot in length. Next slide. So the access aisle has to be a minimum of 5 feet wide, and it has to be the same level as the pull-up space. So your street level and your access aisle, again, are going to be the same. And it doesn't show a curb ramp there, but if there is an elevation difference between your pedestrian access route and the access aisle, of course you need access to it on a continuous pedestrian access route. You do have to mark it to prevent parking. So again, the surface requirements for firm, stable, and slip resistant. And you can't have big heaves in it. Half an inch opening in the direction of travel. And again, in the public right-of-way, there are no slope requirements. And when you're looking at best practice, even though passenger loading zones are not required, there are some places where it can be helpful to add that access aisle and then access to the sidewalk. It makes it easier for people to get in and out. And you can look towards the building guidelines as some areas where the access board has determined it would be beneficial in their scoping. So if you have an area where you have valet parking, maybe in front of a theater or a busy restaurant or a hotel, you may want to go ahead and put in a passenger loading zone and the access aisle, even though you're doing street parking and not building parking. The same way with the hospital. If there's a lot of passenger drop-off activity coming and people coming and going, it's something that you should consider. Slide number 42. Okay, so passenger loading zones was really short. We're going to talk about transit facilities now. So the standards and guidelines for transit facilities, they're included in the 2010 ADA standards in Chapter 8 in Section 810, but those apply to building sites. So if you have a store that maybe has a retail place that has a bus stop within the parking lot, you would follow those standards. Again, the DOT adopted the ADA standards for transportation facilities in 2006. Those are also for buildings. They have made a few changes, which you will see if you look on the Access Board website. The first part of the DOT, or the 2010 ADA standards, has a section on what DOT changed. But they're generally the same. So we're going to be talking mostly about proposed public right-of-way guidelines because they're all almost exactly the same. Slide 44. So transportation facilities include bus boarding and the lighting areas, bus shelters, bus signs, and rail platform requirements. And they're all included in the DOT standards. So there is a standard for this, even though public right-of-way guidelines have not been finalized. Slide 45. So DOT, when they adopted their guidelines, they kind of put a loophole in here. And it says that public entities have to ensure the construction of bus boarding and lighting areas are accessible to the extent the construction specifications are within their control. And why I say that it's a loophole is that transit agencies don't typically control the right-of-way, and cities frequently don't control the transit companies. So it leaves room for a lot of finger pointing. So the important part about transit facilities is that everybody's working together to look for opportunities to make improvements and to work together to make their facilities accessible. Slide number 46. So the boarding and lighting area that's required for transit stops is a clear space that's 96 inches by 60 inches, or 8 feet by 5 feet. Perpendicular to the road it has to be 8 feet and have a maximum slope of 2%. Parallel to the road, so following the curb line, you can match the grade of the road, and that's the width that's 5 feet. And you can include the width of the curb in the boarding and lighting area measurements. Next slide. So here, this is just a picture that shows parallel to the roadway and perpendicular to the roadway for the slopes. And if you think about if a bus is sitting on a hill, the floor of the bus is parallel with the surface of the road, and that ramp is going to come out from the bus even with the floor. So the sidewalk and the street really need to be at the same grade or running slope. Slide 48. And here's some examples of bad boarding and lighting areas. And you never have to look far to find good examples of bad access, and these are both within half a mile of where I live. So you have to have a clear boarding and lighting area. And you can see the picture on the left they did the right thing by adding a boarding and lighting area that extends beyond the sidewalk, so they had their full 8 feet. But then they came back and they put a trash can right in the middle of it. So a person can't really get around that boarding area to get onto a bus ramp very easily. And the picture on the right is a bench. It's sitting beside a 4-lane busy road, and you can barely see in the pictures there's guardrail on both sides that comes all the way out to the face of the curb. So I've always wanted to stop and get a better picture of this, but I don't even want to stop and get out of my car in this area. So if you think about a person who's using a wheelchair or even a person with a vision impairment walking along this road, they have to be in the street. They can't even be up in the grass to get to this bench and then wait for the bus. So this is an unfortunate situation. But you see a lot of strange transit stops when you really think about them from an accessibility standpoint. So you have to make sure your boarding and lighting area is clear, that you have a pedestrian access route that it connects to, and if you have a bench, and there's no requirement for a bench, but that you have a clear space near it, and you have to look at the overall safety aspect for all pedestrians, and especially those who may be stuck in the street and can't get up in the grass, at all without a curb ramp. Slide number 49. And benches, like I said, public right-of-way guideline has a requirement for 50% of benches at a location to have a 30 by 48 clear space. So you can see that this bench has plenty of space around it, and it's on an accessible route. It's part of a very wide sidewalk. Do you have to follow the bench requirements for a transit bench? And the answer to that is no. If you're used to looking at bench requirements and specifications in the building environment, if you think about the scoping for those benches, they're in locker rooms and spas, changing rooms, basically where a person may have to lay down to change their clothes. So that is certainly not what we want to have going on in the right-of-way. So there are no technical requirements for benches on the public right-of-way, but 50% of them do have to have a clear space so that a person who's using a wheelchair can place themselves beside the bench, to have a conversation with a friend. Slide number 50. If you have a bus shelter, it has to be on an accessible route, and you have to have room for a wheelchair entirely within the shelter. So that's your clear space. And if you look at the picture, you can see the 30 by 48 space laid out inside the bus shelter. So if you have a bench all the way across the bus shelter, unless it's very, very deep and it allows for a person to sit in front of the bench and still be sheltered, you really need to have a clear space at the end. You have to have a route getting from the shelter to the boarding and alighting area, and you have to be able to get to your other pedestrian access route. And it's also important that you don't have any protruding objects, because all of this is in an area of circulation, of the circulation path. Slide 51. And this, like I said, if you have bus shelters, you have to have an accessible route that connects the space in the shelter and the boarding and alighting area, and then you have to be able to connect to a sidewalk or street, however you're going to get to that bus shelter and to that boarding and alighting area. Slide 52. So when we talk about connecting boarding and alighting areas and shelters, you can have a bus shelter and a boarding and alighting area where you have no sidewalk, but that's assuming that everyone is going to walk in the street. So if you look at the picture on the left, this is a bus stop that actually is pretty well done. There are no sidewalks in this area. It's on the outskirts of a town. On the left side of the road where you can't see, there are businesses and a neighborhood. So this is a safe place that a bus can stop in the lane, and there's a boarding and alighting area. There is a curb ramp and access to the crosswalk. People can get up and down. There's a clear space to wait safely out of traffic, and everything is connected well. On the right is just a kind of a typical bus stop. And one of the reasons this is a good design is you've got space between the sidewalk and the curb to put your transit shelter. So you've got a clear sidewalk and people aren't walking around the transit stop. And you've got plenty of space here for boarding and alighting. Slide 53. And it's also important that we look at the bus route signs. They have to comply with the requirements for visual characters that are found in 703. And we don't talk a lot about the sign characters in the right-of-way guidelines, but this is one of the places where it's important. People need to be able to find the correct bus stop and know that they're going to be getting on the correct bus. Slide 54. So there are specific requirements. For finish and contrast, you need to have light on dark or dark on light. It needs to be a simple style character, and there are very specific proportions and characters and line spacings. Character height, if you want someone to see the characters from 15 feet away, they need to be 2 inches high. If you want someone to see up to 21 feet, then they need to be 3 inches high. If you want it to be seen more than 21 feet, there's a complicated formula that you can look up in Section 703 or at the end of Section 4 in the right-of-way guidelines. And the route number, the information that's most important is the route. So you can see this is a bus stop for route number 54 in the picture. Next slide. So the other information that you find at a bus stop is usually the bus schedule or the timetable Sometimes you'll find a map for the larger system. And these are not required to meet the character requirements. There's a lot of information that's given, and it just isn't realistic. It's infeasible, basically. But you can also look at what best practice would be to look at what your other options are. There are places now that have audible options available that provide real-time information. So you might have to push a button, and if you have to push a button, it's going to be important that you have a locator tone or something that allows a person to find that button and know that it's there. But it could tell you that bus number 54 is coming at 8:30, or the wait time for the next shuttle is 3 minutes. So audible options are helpful to a lot of people, and they can help provide real-time information that we're all pretty spoiled with our cell phones these days. Slide number 56. And we're not going to talk a lot about rail stations. This is pretty much it, because those are covered under the building standards. But they have to comply with DOT standards. And this is another place where you need to have detectable warnings. So if the drop-off or the boarding area is not protected by screens, you need detectable warnings. And this also applies to bus platforms. So whether it's a rail station or maybe a bus rapid transit, if you have a platform that's elevated above regular curb height, that's the type of platform that you need to include detectable warnings for. Next slide. So I purposely kept these short this time so we'd have plenty of time for questions. There are a lot of resources out there. The U.S. Access Board is a great resource. You can look on their website, and you can also email technical assistance questions to row@access-board.gov, and you generally will get a written response back. You can also contact your Federal Highway State Division office. They are a great resource for local regulations, in addition to the federal regulations. And the Department of Justice provides quite a few technical assistance manuals on their website. And soon we will have a resource page, or a resource handout on Transcend's webpage. Slide 58. So I think we're ready for questions now. And Nancy, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. That was a lot of great information. We do have some questions already, and again, just to remind folks of how to submit questions, you can type them into the chat box, and we will get them that way. You can email them to adatraining@transcend.org. Or you can even call us on our direct line at 301-217-0124 if you would like to get in touch with us directly. But we do have several questions while folks are sort of thinking things through and getting their questions in. To start with, could you talk a little bit about the dimensions for on-street accessible parking spaces?
There are no Access Board required dimensions for on-street spaces for parallel parking or for head-in or angled parking. It's generally the same size as the typical parking space. So some cities will have an 8-foot wide space. Some cities will have a 10-foot wide space depending on how far out they've built their streets. The access aisle specifications are 5 feet for parallel parking and 8 feet for angled and perpendicular parking. And if you're counting space where you don't have markings, it's 20 foot in length for a car space, but you don't have to mark your spaces at 20 feet in length.
Okay, great, thank you. Can access aisles for parallel parking and or for passenger loading zones overlap the sidewalk?
You can. So if you have a sidewalk that drops down to street level, and say you have parallel parking spaces on each side, you can use that as an access aisle for your parking.
Now here's a question about for a bus stop, can the boarding and alighting area overlap the clear space within the shelter?
She may have lost. There's got to be one question. Okay. So, sorry, Nancy. Yes, if you have a boarding and alighting area and you have space within your shelter, but maybe a narrow sidewalk, you can use part of the shelter space or the clear space in the shelter for your boarding and alighting area. If you don't have a full 8 feet from the front of the curb, or from the front of the curb back to the end of your boarding and alighting area specifically, it can extend into the shelter.
Great, thank you. Now here's a question about another question about bus stops. What if there are articulated buses, the Brendy buses? If you have those types in the system, does the bus stop have to be able to connect to each section of the bus?
It does, Nancy. So if you know that you have, let's say, articulated buses that are 50 or 60 feet long, and you have doors at the front of that space, or doors at the front of the bus and doors at the back, and they're both used for loading and unloading, you do have to have a boarding and alighting area that provides access to both of those doors.
Okay, great, thank you. Now here's a question that someone has asked about whether there was a supplemental notice to the right-of-way guidelines in 2015.
So the last published document for the public right-of-way guidelines was the supplementary notice that came out in 2013. There was something that came out in 2015 that was really important that people are familiar with, and that was a technical memo from the Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation, and it related to resurfacing streets and what types of resurfacing were considered alterations. And we talked about that quite a bit in the last section, but resurfacing streets is also one of those things that, while it's not specifically called out in that technical memo, because it was specifically towards or related to curb ramp alterations, it is an opportunity to do parking improvements when you resurface a street. So that's what came out in 2015.
Okay, great. That might be what they're thinking of. So that's helpful to help us sort that out. And we have a question here about curb access in private parking lots, like at stores and malls and things of that nature now. What governs accessibility requirements there?
Excuse me, if you have parking on a building site or commercial property, those are typically covered under Title III. It could be a city government parking lot also, which would be covered under Title II. But those are considered part of a building site. So they do have a little bit different requirements. They have slope requirements, and there are different scoping numbers for those in different situations, like residential and medical facilities. So you would look towards the 2010 ADA standards for those parking requirements. Okay, thank you. That helps to sort that out.
Now we have a couple questions here about transition plans, which you've mentioned a couple of times. Could you talk a little bit about who's required to have those and how that works, and when they're required to have a transition plan?
So a transition plan is a plan to make your facilities accessible if you're a Title II entity. So Title II entities, again, are state and local governments, so city, county, or a township. If you have 50 employees or more, then you're required to have a transition plan. And whether or not, no matter how many employees you have to do a self-evaluation to identify what your obstacles to access are. But when you have a transition plan, you're required to identify those obstacles and then actually come up with a plan to alleviate the barriers. You have to have a schedule, and there has to be a responsible person. So parking is one of those things, if you haven't updated a transition plan or done a transition plan, but you want to make it look like you're doing a good faith effort to make some progress, parking is an easy thing to do, because a lot of times you're not doing an alteration if you're just doing an accessibility upgrade. And you can go in and put your accessible parking at the end of the block and provide access to a curb ramp for the cost of a sign and maybe a different meter. So parking is one of the easy low-hanging fruits for a transition plan.
Thanks. We have another question here about bus stops. The question is, do I understand that we could not put in a new bus stop with just a sign, where they're in an area where there may be no sidewalks? It's not uncommon in our area to see a bus stop that's designated with just a sign. Is that something that basically covered entities really can no longer do?
So if you put a sign in the grass where you don't have a sidewalk, you're really forcing all of your pedestrians to use the street to access that bus stop. So whether a person has disability or not, it becomes a pedestrian safety issue. But where I don't have a mobility disability, so I might walk along the grass behind the back of the curb, my friends who use wheelchairs will have to be out in traffic. It also makes it really difficult for a bus to stop and drop a ramp or a lift in order to get someone who has to sit in the street to pick them up in so they can get into the bus. So there's nothing that specifically says that. It just doesn't meet any of the requirements for, I guess, for safety, really. And if you think about a person who uses a power chair, the chair and the person could weigh over 600 pounds. So if you are, that's the weight, the minimum weight for a bus lift. That's why I say that. If you think about a 600-pound wheelchair trying to get traction in the wet grass after a heavy rain, they just end up four-wheeling in the mud. So getting behind the curb into a grassy area where the bus stop is really isn't suitable at all.
Well, that's good design advice. It just sounds like that's just not your best design. Now we have a question here about, and maybe you'll understand this question, about parking spaces in a parking area where the spaces are not marked, but there are pay stations, kiosks to pay for parking that are up on a curb, which places all the operable controls out of reach range and no way to get up to that level. What kinds of solutions might be available for something like that?
The parking spaces in that situation should be at one end of the block or the other, where a person has access to the curb ramp Unfortunately, they may have to go back half a block to get to the pay station if there's only one on the block. They do have to be marked. The accessible spot has to be marked, at least with a sign. So that should leave the space at the end of the block clear. And if the kiosk has not been designed to provide access so that a person can see the information or use the operable parts, they need to address that with whoever owns the right-of-way, either the state or the city. These requirements have been out a lot longer than people have been using pay stations for parking. You know, you can a lot of times take care of parking with a phone app, but we certainly don't depend on anything like that for meeting the minimum accessibility requirements.
Great advice. We have a question here about the end of the block sort of accessible parking space so that it can be near the curb ramp. And the person's asking if that creates any kind of safety concerns to have the accessible parking space and then the route to get to the curb ramp near an intersection. If there are safety concerns, and if so, if there are design features or strategies that can help make that a more safe sort of design.
Wouldn't put an accessible parking space in a place where you wouldn't put a regular parking space. So if you are looking for a sight distance of, 20 or 30 feet away from the intersection so people can see cars coming, you wouldn't put your accessible space in that sight distance area. You would make the first space available the one that's accessible. And is it less safe? Yes. I mean, if you have an access aisle and you can get out in an area that's protected either by the parking lane or the curb, that of course is safer. If you're a driver, all drivers who have to get out next to a lane with moving vehicles are vulnerable. So it takes longer for a person with disability sometimes to get out of the car and maybe get their walker or their wheelchair situated. That's why it's important to look at where you decide to put those accessible spaces on the perimeter of a block. You would want to put them on a lower volume road, one that's not real steep so it's easier to get in and out of. So you kind of have to look at the big picture.
That's good advice. Great advice. Thank you. We have one, it's really a comment more than a question here, but one individual wanted to share a resource with the audience, the FTA's ADA circular. This individual says that it has some great information about bus stops. So there's just another resource for folks. And I think at the moment we do not have any additional questions, but we do still have plenty of time. So please get your questions in, folks, if you would like. Again, type them into the chat box, and we will get them that way. Email them to adatraining@transcend. We do still have time for more questions. So let me just give a check here and see if we have any more coming in. I don't see any at the moment.
To that person who mentioned the FTA circular, it does have a lot of good information in it. You can also find a lot of good resources if you go through FTA or go through Federal Highway. Federal Highway, it's probably been almost 10 years ago now, put out a really good guide on transit stops and the proper construction, good design ideas, how to manage alterations. And I haven't looked at it for a long time, so I can't tell you what the name of the document is. But if you were to go to Federal Highway's website and in their search box just type in bus shelters or bus stops or transit stops, I'm sure that it would come up pretty near the top of the list. You could also contact Federal Highway for that information. And if anyone has questions about some of the other webinars that we've already done, feel free to send those in too with questions. So I thought that I would give us plenty of time today. And
well, and you did. Well, and you did. You did give us plenty of time. I'll tell you what we can do, though, while we're giving folks just a few more minutes to maybe get some questions submitted. We can go ahead and give folks our sort of final information here. On slide 59, we can let folks know about the next and final session in our series here. We can now just about check off part 3 in our 4-part series. We've talked today about curbside access, transit stops and parking, passenger loading zones. We've gotten a ton of good information as usual. And we have one final session coming up on ensuring access on public right-of-way projects, where we'll talk about design decisions, construction inspection, and best practices. So I hope everyone will plan on joining us for that final session. And on slide 60, we will go ahead and we will give folks the code that you will need if you are going to be getting a certificate of participation or credits for the AIA. The code word is CURB. CURB is the code word for today's session. So again, consult the email that you received about this session and follow the instructions in that email on how to get your certificate of participation or your credit. You can email the code. Please email it to adatraining@transcend.org by close of business 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, June the 3rd. Now we do have a couple more questions that have come in here. This question says, if you don't have a sidewalk, should you have pedestrian signals for crossings?
Reach the pedestrian push button. Wait for them to cross.
Okay.
So
now here's another question that's come in. If there's an intersection of a road with a private driveway, does that require a curb ramp?
You have to have a continuous pedestrian access route. So if you have a driveway that's at a different elevation, I'm not sure that I have completely clear what the question is, but if you have an elevation change between the driveway and the sidewalk, you need to have a way to make that change, which is typically a curb ramp. You can just have a grade of 5% or less, and treat it like a driveway crossing really, and come down your sidewalk, cross the driveway, and then back up. So I hope that answers the question. And I think we had some technical difficulty on on the last question about pedestrian signals. And so if you have pedestrian signals but you don't have sidewalks, it's fine to have a crosswalk in that situation. Just because you don't have sidewalks doesn't mean you don't have pedestrians. So if you have a need for signals and you have a need for pedestrian signals, then it's fine to mark that crosswalk. And if you have that situation, you probably want to add a clear space to make sure that people can reach the pedestrian push buttons and have access to the buttons and access to the crosswalk from that area.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Now we have another question here about bus stop design. Could you explain why, if or why, the boarding and alighting area needs to be at the height of the curb for proper deployment of the ramp from the bus?
So it doesn't have to be. If you have a shoulder and that's where all the pedestrians wait, the bus ramp or lift can drop down to ground level just as easily. It does make the bus ramp steeper, but typically you find bus boarding and alighting areas behind the back of the curb. It doesn't have to be. So if you don't have sidewalks, you don't have a curb, you can put your boarding and alighting area, if it needs to have that firm, stable, slip-resistant surface. And you don't necessarily have to have that curb line there.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Let me check here. I think that it was the last question that we had. Let me just check one final time to see if we have any more coming in. So we do still have time, folks, to get your questions in.
One of the questions I get,
I do not see.
One of the questions I get a lot is who's responsible for boarding and alighting areas and making sure that they're accessible. And a lot of times the city, they say we don't have access, we don't have control of where the transit agencies put their bus stops, and the transit agencies say, well, we don't control the right-of-way and we don't build sidewalks, so we don't have to do it either. And so the question of who's responsible is really everybody's responsible, because if a pedestrian is injured because they're in the street, everybody's going to get sued. So it's best to be proactive and make sure that everyone's working together so that there's an opportunity when the city does an upgrade that they take transit into account when they do their sidewalk improvements. So it's really everybody's responsibility. And if people who use public transit are having problems, they need to contact the transit agency in the city and try to get those resolved rather than have to go to the Department of Justice or the DOT to file a complaint.
Well, that's certainly good advice. We do have another question now about pay stations. Do you have any ideas for best practices or thoughts on are pay stations better at the ends of blocks or in the middle of the block, depending on where your accessible parking is?
So it depends on, I guess if you have a really long block, then you might want to have more than one pay station. Really, the pay station, it's not specifically for people who have disabilities, it's for everybody, so it's just as inconvenient. If it's in the middle of the block, it's just as inconvenient for the person who parked at the other end of the block as it is for the person who's parked at the end in the accessible space. So it really doesn't make that much difference where it's located. as far as access. It doesn't have to be on the shortest accessible route or anything like you might think of it in a building. Other things.
Okay, excellent. Good advice. As long as you can get to it, right?
You can get to it, and you're not treated differently than everyone else. So sometimes the facilities that we have as pedestrians are just not ideal. But as long as they're not worse just because a person has a disability, that's where you decide, is this discrimination or is it not discrimination? If we all have to walk in the street and stand in the mud, then that's just the way it is. It's just a bad situation, more or less.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in. Let me just go ahead and jump on to slide 61 here, and we'll just again remind folks of our contact information here at the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. You can reach us, or you can reach your regional ADA center through the toll-free number 800-949-4232. If you're here in the Mid-Atlantic region, in the District of Columbia, or the states of Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, or West Virginia, you will get a hold of us here in the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. If you're outside that region, you will get a hold of one of our sister centers if you have questions about any aspect of the ADA. So let me give one final check here to see if we have any last-minute questions. I don't see any final questions, so we may have to give folks back a few minutes of their afternoon here. But on our final slide, we would like to again say thank you to everyone who joined us, and of course especially to Melissa Anderson, who has once again shared a wealth of information with us. And I suppose that folks will probably be thinking of more questions that maybe they didn't get a chance to ask this afternoon. So remember that we do have another session. Our fourth session will be coming up. And you may have a chance to ask those questions at that time. I see that we do have, I think we do have one final question that's come in here. Let me see here if I can make heads or tails of this. The question is about coordination between the Access Board and the MUTCD and manufacturers, if there's coordination there for designs or best practices. Does that question make sense to you, Melissa?
The Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices is written by a committee, and it's written by the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And they have an annual meeting and several committee meetings during the year. And the Access Board actively participates in those meetings. So Scott Windley, who used to be my colleague till I left, Scott is still involved in the committees, and he goes and is always there. And there are also some other national proponents of access who, I guess when I was there, we all kind of scattered out between the different committees, the pedestrian committee, the signal committee, the striping committee, and tried to make sure that access was not ignored during their proceedings. And I also understand that a new MUTCD is coming out soon. I don't know when. So there's another question. There's another question that I get asked frequently, and that's if you have a narrow right-of-way and you have, let's say, a park entrance in the middle of a block, do you still have to put your accessible parking at the end of the block? And the answer to that would be no. As long as you have direct access to the curb ramp, So you would make sure you had a curb ramp that provided access in the middle of the block, and you would want to stripe so that no one parked in front of it to block it. But you could also put your accessible spaces next to a curb ramp somewhere that was not at the end of the block and consider it equivalent facilitation.
Great design advice. We did have another question come in. Now, you've shared a lot of great resources with us. Are any of them, or are there any others that are really good resources for designing passenger loading zones?
So passenger loading zones, they're not real exciting, so there's not a lot of specific design information on them. It's a pretty simple section to read in the proposed public right-of-way guidelines, and they've also been included, at least for buildings. There's good information in the Access Board guides to the standards. So if you look on the Access Board website and you go to the 2010 ADA, or you go to the ADA standards on the right-hand side of the page, there will be a link on the next page to a guide to the standards. And in that, they have some animations that I highly recommend everybody take a look at. And I'm still happy to promote the Access Board's resources, because really they're the best ones any of us really have right now. And so they have animations on that web page, and then they've broken down the guidelines into different sections. So they've included passenger loading zones and parkings. And again, remember, these are for building sites, and they don't address what's in the public right-of-way guideline. But a lot of things are the same. A lot of things are different, but the ideas are similar in providing access. And at the bottom of those design guides are frequently asked questions. And the Access Board gets a lot of questions over and over and over. And sometimes it's because something isn't perfectly clear in the guide or the standards. So this gives them an opportunity to clarify the actual intent of the standard. So that's the best resource I know. I don't know that anyone has done any specific research or that there's any federal highway guidance specifically on passenger loading zones. But I have to be honest, I've never gone to Federal Highway's website and searched for passenger loading zones. So that would, if I were looking for additional resources, that's probably what I would do.
Well, thanks, Melissa. That is a great resource. I highly recommend the guide as well. It really is a helpful publication, and the animations are very helpful. I believe that is the final question that we have. And so we had a lot of great questions today and a lot of great answers from Melissa and a lot of great information. So I think that brings us close to the bottom of the hour. So I think we will give folks back about 4 minutes of their afternoon. And once again, thank everyone for joining us, and thank Melissa for sharing her knowledge and expertise. And we hope to see everyone back for our next and final session in our series. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Kill the recording.